We only want important people at our wedding, not your kind. Those words weren't shouted. They were spoken with polished arrogance, the kind that cuts deeper than anger ever could. In that moment, years of sacrifice, loyalty, and hard work were dismissed as if they meant nothing. Betrayal doesn't always come with slammed doors or broken promises. Sometimes it hides behind a smile, wrapped in expensive suits and whispered judgments. But what happens when someone decides that silence is no longer an option, and every insult becomes the spark for a reckoning no amount of money can stop? Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I have spent most of my life in rooms that smelled of solder and steel, surrounded by spools of cable, humming generators, and coffee that tasted like ash. That is the world I built for myself, a world I understood. In the corner of my kitchen hangs the photograph of my late wife, her smile caught in the middle of a Sunday picnic years ago. That picture is my compass. Every time I wonder if I have done enough, if I have been enough, I look at her and remember the promise we made when Sophia was born. We would build something lasting, something she could be proud of. She is gone now, but the promise remains. Alvarez Energy and Events, or AEE as people call it, began with a battered Ford truck and jobs nobody else wanted. I took night calls to wire emergency lights for schools, backup systems for small clinics, or temporary power for a county fair when their circuits blew. One job became 10, 10 became 50, and before I knew it, my crews were being called by wineries during harvest, by resorts during fire season, and by hotels hosting conferences for CEOs who never knew my name. 3 decades later, we are the ones people call when the lights must never go out. It was not luck. It was sweat, scarred knuckles, and more missed dinners than I can count. My men, riggers, welders, electricians, are not employees. They are brothers. We built more than stages and systems. We built trust. Sophia, my daughter, was always the best project I ever worked on. She came into this world with lungs that could outshout a drill, and she grew into a woman who never missed an exam, never feared standing in front of a class. I worked double shifts to pay for her education, driving hundreds of miles, and I never missed a single parent conference or graduation. She graduated from UCLA, went into marketing, and carved her life in Santa Monica. My chest still swells when I think about her walking across that stage. For all the buildings, arenas, and gala halls I've powered, nothing compares to raising her. Now she is engaged. His name is Bradley Whitmore, 32 years old, co-founder of Whitmore Hastings Partners, Yale graduate, son of a family that has had its name in Marin County society pages for over a century. When Brad shakes your hand, it feels less like a greeting and more like an audition. He scans the room as if always searching for someone more important to talk to. Maybe I am old-fashioned, but I prefer a man who looks you in the eye and stays there. Sophia insists he is ambitious, forward-looking, and that his polish will give her opportunities I could never offer. I keep my doubts to myself, but a father sees more than a daughter wants to admit. The wedding they have planned is a spectacle. $900,000 spread across 3 venues, a Montecito chapel with whitewashed walls and tall arched windows, a Napa winery for the gala reception, and a Santa Barbara beachfront hotel for the after-party. It is the kind of affair that makes photographers camp outside and society writers sharpen their pens. The Whitmores are footing the bill in name, but I know how much I have already contributed. Deposits, connections, favors called in. My company's roots run deep in these places. I thought of inviting my crews, my neighbors, even old friends who stood with me when the company was just an idea scribbled on a napkin. To me, they are family. To others, they are invisible. Brad has a way of speaking that slides around respect. He compliments, then corrects, as if guiding a child across the street. I catch the way his smile stiffens when I talk about my men, Or when Sophia brings up childhood memories that do not sparkle with champagne. He does not say the word unimportant, not yet, but it lingers in his tone. I see the way he looks at my work boots, at the calluses on my hands, and I know what he is thinking. He was raised to believe that money only counts if it has aged in a cellar. Sophia lives between us, caught in the tension of two worlds. She tells me she loves him, that his family has traditions, that compromise is part of marriage. She wants me to be patient. I try. I bite my tongue. I remind myself that love deserves a chance. But every night, as I pour coffee and sit beneath my wife's photograph, I wonder if love is enough when respect is missing. I promised myself I would not interfere, that I would keep my hands steady and my mouth shut. But fathers know when storms are building. There is a weight in the air, the same weight I felt before wildfires reached the coast and hotels called in desperation. This wedding, polished and planned to the last flower, is about to test everything I have built. And as much as I want to trust that love will hold, I cannot shake the feeling that my daughter's future is standing on scaffolding, and someone forgot to check the bolts. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. The first cuts never look like cuts. They arrive wrapped in polite words, the kind that sound like courtesy until you read the fine print of tone. It began one evening in Sophia's apartment. Brad unfolded the seating chart like it was a corporate merger plan, lines and circles showing who mattered where. My list had names that carried weight in my heart: my foreman, who had been with me since the first county fair job, an old neighbor who fed Sophia when I worked late, a retired parish priest who used to bless our crews before festival season. Brad tapped the chart with the back of his pen. "Mike, maybe we should trim this a little. Your people won't be comfortable with certain donors. We're trying to keep the wedding refined." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes slid past me to Sophia, as if waiting for her to soften the blow. She shifted in her chair, twisting her hands, but said nothing. I felt the sting, but I swallowed it. I had spent years letting insults glance off me like sparks off steel. What was one more? A week later, Brad handed me a business card. "My family's tailor," he said, with the same voice you'd use to recommend a dentist. "It's about optics. First impressions matter." The word optics was his favorite accessory. I looked at the card, crisp black letters embossed on cream. For 30 years, I had worn boots that could walk through oil and smoke, gloves that bore the scars of welds. My clothes were built to hold weight, not to impress a room. But I nodded, folded the card into my wallet, and said nothing. When the seating plan arrived, I found myself at table 16, tucked near the service doors. The same doors I had guarded most of my career, making sure guests never noticed the men behind the curtains. Now I was being asked to sit where I had stood for decades, only this time as family. I wondered if Brad thought irony made him clever. I watched the way he spoke about my people. My foreman, Carlos, became colorful. The kind of word used when a man is treated like an anecdote instead of a professional. Another crewman was labeled a character. It was said with a grin, but the grin was a blade. Sophia's lips tightened, yet her silence was louder than anything she could have said. I kept my expression calm, though inside I was taking notes. At the Montecito Chapel walkthrough, the wedding planner extended a hand and asked what I did. Before I could answer, Brad cut in. "He's in events. In events." As if I strung balloons for a birthday party. I let the words settle in the air, remembering how my crews had wired the chapel's backup power system after the last wildfire. Without us, those arched windows would have glowed dark when the grid went down. But I kept my mouth closed. Pride doesn't need an audience. Later, at the Napa Winery, Brad boasted that the venue loved the Whitmore name. I bit back a laugh. The GM texted me a thank you every Christmas since we kept their harvest safe during a blackout. At the Santa Barbara Hotel, Brad said his mother had personal ties with the management. The director still owed me for the night we kept oxygen systems alive during a wildfire evacuation. But I let Brad parade his lineage. A man who doesn't know where strength comes from has to invent stories to cover the gaps. The word important began to repeat itself like a hymn. Important donors, important families, important optics. Every time he said it, my stomach tightened. I poured coffee late at night and stared at my wife's photo on the wall. She seemed to ask if I would let our daughter marry into a family that measured worth by invitations and fabrics. I told myself to wait. Sophia was in love. Love deserved its chance, even if I doubted the ground it stood on. But the word stayed with me. Important. It clanged in my head like a loose bolt on scaffolding, warning me that the structure could not hold. I tried to ignore it, but deep down I knew. The storm was gathering, and the wind was already bending the beams. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. I've learned in 30 years of business that words are like sparks. They fly fast, but they can burn if you're not careful. That's why I record every business call. Too many times, people said one thing on the phone and denied it when the paperwork came due. So, when Brad called me early one morning, speaking with that calm arrogance he thought passed for wisdom, I let the recorder run. He launched into a lecture about different levels of society, as if explaining to a child why some toys were too expensive. There's old money and refined money, Mike, he said. There's a language some people understand, and others never will. I let him talk. His voice dripped with condescension, spelling out a world where I didn't belong. According to him, my money was raw, unpolished, good enough for boots, but not good enough for ballrooms. I didn't interrupt. I wanted his words captured, not argued with. When the call ended, I sat at my desk staring at the recorder. He thought he was educating me, but he had just given me ammunition. Something in his tone made me dig deeper, beyond the insults. A man that eager to define hierarchy was usually hiding cracks in his own foundation. I dialed a friend at the state regulatory office, someone who owed me a favor from years back when my crews had kept the lights on during a power crisis. "What do you know about Whitmore Hastings Partners?" I asked. The silence on the other end lasted longer than it should have. "Mike," he said carefully, "you didn't hear this from me, but there have been reports. Nothing public yet." That was enough to send a chill through me. I called another friend, a banker who handled risk assessments. He whistled when he heard the firm's name. "Smoke," he said. "A lot of smoke." My gut tightened. Smoke usually meant fire. Later that week, I met a former analyst from the firm behind a food truck in downtown Santa Barbara. He was young, nervous, the kind of man who had seen too much too soon. He slid a manila folder across the counter while pretending to order tacos. "Don't say my name," he muttered. I nodded and opened the folder in my truck. Inside were red flag reports, suspicious activity notices, transfers routed through offshore crypto exchanges, and donor-advised funds that looked more like laundry machines than charities. Numbers moved in circles that made no sense unless you knew what debts needed covering. It was all too familiar. Someone robbing Peter to pay Paul, except in this case, Peter was an elderly investor, and Paul was a blackjack dealer. I felt my stomach knot. Brad wasn't just dismissing my background. He was dangerous. He wasn't building a life with my daughter. He was building an escape plan, and she was his parachute. That night, Sophia called me. Her voice was bright, almost giddy. "Dad, Brad just announced a new sponsor for the wedding program. Isn't it amazing?" She gave me the name, and I felt the blood rush to my ears. That sponsor was in the file, one of the accounts flagged for suspicious transfers. I held my voice steady. "That's impressive, honey," I said, but my chest burned. I couldn't shatter her excitement with half-formed accusations, not yet. I poured whiskey into a glass and sat at the kitchen table under my wife's picture. She seemed to stare back, asking why I wasn't protecting Sophia already. I told her in silence that I needed proof solid enough to withstand denial. Love makes people blind, but documents make judges listen. The deeper I thought, the clearer it became. Brad wasn't just trimming me out of the wedding. He was pruning my daughter's entire life, shaping it to graft onto his failing branch. He needed her name, her innocence, and eventually, my company. The final confirmation came when I reviewed a draft of the prenup. Brad had slipped in an addendum written like corporate jargon, a joint growth vehicle requiring Sophia to pledge 15% of any future Alvarez Energy and Events equity. It was buried among pages about mutual respect and inheritance protections. Most people would have skimmed past it, but I read contracts the way I read blueprints. Every line matters. My jaw clenched. There it was, the real motive. He didn't want a marriage, he wanted a merger. He wasn't after love, he was after leverage, and he was planning to chain my daughter's future to his debts. I closed the folder and shut off the light. My heart beat steady, like it did before a big job. This wasn't about optics anymore. It wasn't about tuxedos or table placements. It was about survival, my daughters, my companies, and the dignity of everything I had built. Brad thought he was marrying a lifeline. What he didn't know was that I'd spent my life wiring circuits that could shut down in an instant. The first incident had landed, and now I knew. Silence was no longer an option. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. The first step was not to blow anything up, but to test the seams, to see where Brad's carefully painted walls would crack if I leaned. I started with the Napa Winery. The GM, a man I'd known since his assistant days, met me in a cold barrel room that smelled of oak and fermenting grapes. His breath fogged as he listened, arms folded tight across his chest. I told him enough to make him uneasy, but not enough to drag him into the fire. I mentioned one of the sponsors Brad had secured, pointed out the strange financial patterns that didn't look like philanthropy. I didn't mention the folder of flagged accounts or the ex-analyst who had passed it to me. He didn't need the details. He only needed to know that standing next to the Whitmores might not be safe. He leaned against a barrel and didn't touch his espresso. "We'll review this at the board level," he said slowly. That was all I needed, a promise to look deeper. In my world, that meant hesitation. And hesitation spreads like cracks in ice. As I drove back toward the coast, I thought about how trust works. The winery board would listen to me because 3 years ago, when their harvest was threatened by a power outage, my crews rolled in at midnight and kept their cooling tanks running. Grapes that would have spoiled turned into wine. They remembered. Reputation isn't about speeches or society columns. It's about who shows up when the lights go out. My next stop was the beachfront hotel in Santa Barbara, where the after-party was booked. I met the director of events in his office overlooking the ocean. He smiled politely, but when I reminded him of the wildfire evacuation 2 summers ago, when we wired backup oxygen systems for the ballroom-turned-shelter, his smile softened into something more human. "You kept us afloat that night," he admitted. I nodded. "And now I'm asking you to think carefully about whose name you want on your next gala." I left without pressing harder. Plant the seed, walk away. That's how trust grows. The fire marshal was my third call. We met in his cluttered office, where blueprints and codebooks fought for space with coffee mugs and family photos. I slid Brad's crowd plan across his desk. He uncapped his red pen like a surgeon preparing for work. Within minutes, the page was bleeding circles and notes. Overcrowding, improper exits, unsafe pyrotechnics. Brad had assumed money could oil the gears of safety, but compliance isn't something you buy. It's something you respect. And the marshal respected me because I'd never asked him to bend the rules, only to help me enforce them. I told myself I wasn't wrecking a wedding. I was keeping it from turning into a stage for laundering money and reputation. My conscience needed that reminder. I wasn't a bitter father. I was a builder protecting his daughter from a collapse she couldn't yet see. That night, Sophia called about the rehearsal dinner. It was scheduled at a private club that once mocked my crews when we weren't members, only to call me later begging for power when their generator failed. "Dad, will you come?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "It would mean a lot." I closed my eyes. "Honey, I won't sit in rooms that despise the hands that built them." Silence stretched. "You're being stubborn," she whispered. Maybe I was, but some rooms are poison, and I wouldn't drink from their cups. By the end of the week, the first cracks were visible. The chapel confirmed they'd still host the ceremony, but the Napa Winery put the gala under advisement. The hotel delayed confirmation, citing internal discussions. Brad didn't know it yet, but the ground under his perfect plan was softening. I called a lawyer I trusted, a victim's attorney who had fought for small families against large corporations. I didn't tell him everything, only enough to prepare an escrow of documents. If regulators hesitated, if Brad struck back with lawsuits, the evidence would not disappear. It was a safety net, another beam shoring up the weight I was about to carry. Late that night, sitting in my office, I thought about Sophia's future. I imagined her name tied to Brad's debts, her laughter replaced by worry, her career shackled to a man's desperate schemes. I couldn't let that happen. This wasn't about table assignments or tuxedos anymore. It was about chains. Chains Brad was already trying to clasp around her wrists, hidden under the language of love. I tightened my grip on the folder of documents. The storm was building, and I had just placed the first sandbags. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. By dawn, the cracks had widened into chasms. The winery board froze the gala booking, claiming they needed clarification on sponsorship documentation. The private club canceled outright, citing unexpected maintenance. I knew the language. They were pulling their hands out of the fire before it burned them. By breakfast, Brad's perfect wedding had already lost 2 of its crown jewels. At 10 o'clock, the sound of polished leather echoed on my shop floor. Brad stormed in, his designer loafers gleaming against the dust of concrete, his suit sharp but his face flushed with fury. My crew looked up from their cables, their hands pausing mid-coil. They had seen storms before, but this one came dressed in silk. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Brad barked, his voice cracking under pressure. "You've sabotaged century-old relationships in less than 48 hours. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned back against a workbench, arms folded. My men kept working, though their ears stretched in our direction. "What I've done," I said quietly, "or what you've built that can't stand without crumbling." He stepped closer, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Don't play coy. You've turned venues against us, poisoned deals that were set in stone. You're trying to ruin my wedding because you can't stand that Sophia chose me." I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I pulled a folded document from my jacket and slid it across the bench. The prenup addendum, the one buried in legal jargon about joint growth vehicles. His eyes flicked to it, then quickly back to me, too fast to hide his guilt. "Explain this," I said. Brad's mouth twisted. "That's synergy. It's family growth, standard practice when 2 families with businesses merge futures." I shook my head slowly. "That's theft in daylight. You're not merging futures. You're plotting to siphon 15% of the company I built with my hands. The company that put food on Sophia's table when you were still in prep school, lacrosse shorts." He flinched but recovered with a smirk. "You think too small, Mike. This is about elevating everyone, about scale." "Scale?" I snapped. "You mean using my daughter's name and my company's value to patch holes in your sinking ship?" The door burst open, and Sophia rushed in. Her makeup was streaked, her hair pulled back like she hadn't slept. "Stop it, both of you," she cried, stepping between us. "You're tearing everything apart." "Ask him, Sophia," I said, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. "Ask your fiancé why his marriage plan included carving up Alvarez energy and events." Her eyes darted to Brad, searching for denial, for reassurance. He opened his mouth, but the silence stretched too long. She looked back at me, her face pale. "Is this true?" she whispered. Brad stammered, "It's just logistics, strategy. Everyone benefits." I cut him off. "The only one who benefits is him, and you'd be shackled to his debts before you even said your vows." The air in the shop grew thick. My men pretended to work, but the clang of tools had gone quiet. Sophia's tears streaked down her cheeks, her breath ragged. "Can't this be salvaged?" she begged. "Can't we make it work?" I softened my tone, but not my resolve. Only if truth matters more than appearances. Only if love doesn't mean erasing everything we've built. Before Brad could answer, my phone buzzed on the bench. A message from the hotel director. The after-party ballroom was voided, citing ethics review. A second alert followed from the fire marshal. Brad's permit flagged and frozen. The scaffolding of his wedding collapsed in real time. Brad's face drained of color. He grabbed the prenup paper and slammed it down again. "You did this." You're orchestrating everything. You can't stand losing control." I met his fury with calm. "No, Brad. I just know the difference between building with steel and building with smoke." By afternoon, whispers were already sliding through society circles. A columnist posted a blind item. "One upcoming Napa Gala may be haunted by ghost donors and questionable financing." The comments spread like fire through dry brush. Brad's phone lit up with calls he didn't answer. That evening, as I sat in my office replaying his recorded words, a new message arrived in my inbox. Anonymous sender. Subject line, "You should see this." I clicked, and the name Hastings appeared, Brad's own business partner. Attached were screenshots of internal chats, emails with Brad's edits on forged donor letters. Hastings' note was short. "I can't go down with him. Help me get whistleblower counsel, and I'll give you everything." I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor lighting the edges of the room. The storm wasn't just gathering, it was here. Brad's motives, his desperation, his schemes, they were all laid bare now. For the first time, I saw the endgame clearly. And I knew the next move was mine. The documents sat on my desk like live wires, their edges sharp with implication. Hastings had delivered enough evidence to bury Brad 10 times over. Forged donor letters, offshore transfers, fraudulent sponsorship commitments. Each page hummed with the weight of betrayal. I read them twice, then shut the folder and leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan as it cut slow circles. If I acted, Sophia's wedding would not just collapse, it would shatter in front of hundreds. But if I stayed silent, I would be handing her future to a man who saw her as nothing more than collateral. Late that night, I heard the creak of the front porch. Sophia stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes swollen from crying. She looked smaller than I remembered, like the little girl who once crawled into my bed after nightmares. "Dad," she whispered, "is it true? All of it?" I pulled the folder across the table. "Sit," I said softly. She lowered herself into the chair like gravity was heavier than usual. I opened the folder, page by page. First, the prenup addendum. 15% of Alvarez Energy and Events pledged into a so-called joint growth vehicle. Her hands trembled as she read it. "He told me it was standard," she murmured. "Standard theft," I corrected. Then I slid over the Hastings files. Emails showing Brad editing donor letters, wiring funds through shell accounts. Finally, I reached for my phone and played a recording of Brad's own words, dripping with arrogance. "There's a difference between new money and refined money. Elena is marrying into a higher world now." The silence that followed this was heavier than any generator I'd ever carried. Sophia covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, her breath shallow. "He never loved me," she said between sobs. "He just saw dollar signs." I reached across the table and held her wrist. "No, honey. He saw a lifeline. You were never the problem. His rot runs deeper than you can imagine." We sat there for a long time, her tears soaking the prenup pages, my silence holding her steady. Finally, she lifted her head. "What do we do now?" "That's the choice," I told her. "We can end it quietly, cancel the wedding, send the guests home, or we let the truth out, in public, where it belongs. Brad didn't just try to trap you, he's stealing from families, retirees, people who trusted him. If we bury this, we're giving him another chance to hurt someone else." She looked at me, torn between shame and fury. "If we do this publicly, everyone will know. The whispers, the headlines. Better headlines than handcuffs on your wrists for debts that aren't yours," I said firmly. The sound of tires on gravel cut through the night. Brad. He pushed into the kitchen without knocking, hair disheveled, suit wrinkled, eyes wild. "Mike, Sophia, listen to me." His voice wavered between pleading and commanding. He dropped into the chair opposite us. "We can fix this. I'll withdraw the prenup clause. Forget the addendum ever existed. We'll go through with the wedding, keep everything intact. You don't have to do this." I met his gaze. "You don't erase rot by painting the walls, Brad." He slammed his fist on the table. "Do you think you can destroy me? Do you know who my family is?" Sophia stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her tears had dried, leaving only fire in her eyes. "Enough," she said, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "I won't marry a man who used me as collateral. I won't marry a liar, a thief, a coward." Brad's mouth fell open. He turned to me, searching for control, but I stayed silent. This was her moment. She grabbed the prenup pages, crumpled them in her fists, and tore them down the middle. The sound of ripping paper filled the kitchen like thunder. She threw the pieces at him. "We're done," she said. "You don't get me. You don't get my father. You don't get our name. All you get is the truth." Brad's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing left for him here. He stumbled out, slamming the door behind him, the sound echoing across the quiet house. Sophia sank back into the chair, her chest heaving. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You chose dignity, baby girl," I said softly. "That's the only choice that matters." Her eyes filled again, but this time not with despair, with resolve. For the first time in months, she wasn't drifting between worlds. She was standing firmly in her own. And I knew, whatever came next, we would face it together. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 5 below to let me know you're with me. The morning after Sophia tore the prenup in two, the house felt like the eye of a storm. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Emails, voicemails, texts piling in. Guests demanded to know why the ceremony had been postponed. Vendors sent polite but nervous messages, their tone careful, as if they sensed a scandal but weren't sure how deep it ran. The polite word postponed was already losing its disguise. Everyone knew something was broken. By noon, Brad was scrambling to control the narrative. His social media page lit up with a carefully staged video filmed in what looked like his family's study. He wore a pressed suit and a solemn expression, speaking directly into the camera about unethical business coercion and an attempt to sabotage a private celebration. Within an hour, his old money allies reposted the clip, praising his composure, calling him a victim. But cracks spread fast. Comments began asking about irregularities in his firm, about the sudden disappearance of major donors. The tide was turning, even if he couldn't see it yet. Sophia stayed in her room most of that day. I knocked softly around lunchtime, carrying a plate of food, but found her sitting at her vanity, still in pajamas, staring at her untouched wedding gown. It hung in the corner like a ghost, all lace and silk, waiting for a day that would never come. She didn't look at me at first. "Dad," she said finally, her voice hoarse, "I feel so stupid. How could I not see it?" I set the plate down and put a hand on her shoulder. "You weren't stupid," I told her. "You were targeted. He knew how to talk, how to charm, how to make you feel like you belonged to something bigger. That isn't foolishness, it's proof of how badly he wanted you." She let out a broken laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "I almost gave him everything." "You gave him nothing," I said firmly. "You stopped before it was too late. That's what matters." That evening, support began arriving in ways I hadn't expected. Carlos, my foreman, stopped by with his wife, leaving a casserole on the counter without a word. An old client whose event we had saved years ago sent flowers with a handwritten note. To Sophia, may you find joy beyond this disappointment. Even neighbors we hadn't spoken to in months knocked on the door just to say they were with us. The so-called unimportant people filled our home with more warmth than Brad's high society circle ever had. But the wider world was less kind. By dusk, a local columnist had published a piece hinting at financial irregularities within Whitmore Hastings Partners. The headline was blunt: "Lavish Napa wedding stumbles amid questions of shady sponsors." Reporters started calling my office phone, sensing I knew more than I let on. I refused to comment, but I knew the dam had cracked. Soon the water would come roaring through. That night, when the house was quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife's photo watching over me. The guilt pressed down hard. Had I acted too late? I replayed Sophia's tears, her voice breaking as she admitted she felt like a pawn. My chest ached with the weight of it. Maybe if I had confronted Brad sooner, she wouldn't be suffering now. Maybe my silence had given him too much time. The phone rang close to midnight. Margaret Whitmore's voice cut through like a blade. "You've destroyed my son's future," she hissed. Do you think your little company can survive what my family can do to it? We will ruin you, Mr. Alvarez. You don't belong in our world, and you never will. I listened calmly, her words sharp but empty compared to the weight of the evidence stacked in my office. Your family didn't need my help to destroy your future, I replied. Your son managed that on his own. Reputation is earned, Mrs. Whitmore, not inherited. And then I hung up, leaving her fury buzzing on the other end of the line. When I finally went to bed, the night felt heavy with unease. The wedding was canceled, yes, but the fight wasn't over. Brad's empire was unraveling, and his family was lashing out like cornered animals. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, knowing the storm hadn't passed. It was only beginning, and the hammer of the law was about to fall. The storm had left its wreckage, but as I walked into my office Monday morning, I saw something I hadn't noticed in weeks: loyalty. My crew nodded at me with quiet respect. Clients called, not to withdraw contracts, but to remind me of the years we'd built together. Even a local pastor stopped by with coffee, placing a hand on my shoulder as if to say, "You did right." The Whitmores might have their money and their threats, but I had something far stronger. People who knew me, who had seen me work, who trusted what my name stood for. That afternoon, I met with the victim's attorney I had retained earlier. We sat across from each other in a small conference room, the whistleblower files spread between us. He turned each page carefully, nodding grimly. "This is solid," he said. "Hastings' cooperation changes everything. With this and the recordings, regulators will move quickly. Brad's looking at criminal charges." Hearing it out loud was both a relief and a weight. My silence was over. Action had to follow. When I came home that night, Sophia was waiting at the kitchen table, her hair tied back, her face clear of makeup. She looked older, sharper, but also steadier than before. "Dad," she said, "I don't just want to move on. I want to make this right. Brad hurt people, families, retirees, people who trusted him. If we only protect ourselves, then we're no better than the Palmers and Whitmores who cover up their messes." Her words hit me hard. I had been thinking about defense, about shielding her, shielding the company, but she was already thinking beyond that. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. She straightened. "Alvarez Energy and Events has done well. We could set up a fund, something to help the victims. Maybe not enough to replace everything they lost, but enough to give them hope back." I felt my throat tighten. For the first time in weeks, I saw the daughter I had raised, the one who used to spend weekends on job sites handing out bottled water to workers, who had written essays about fairness and opportunity. She had been trapped in Brad's shadow, but now she was stepping into her own light. "That's exactly what we'll do," I said. Later that evening, we sat together drafting a statement. Nothing flashy, nothing combative, just truth. We would not let Brad write the story. The words came slowly but firmly. Our family believes integrity matters more than appearances. The evidence will speak for itself. We will continue to support the community that has supported us. I signed it, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt in control again. Around midnight, Hastings called. His voice was tired, broken by guilt. "I should have stopped him sooner," he admitted. "I told him the forged letters were a line we couldn't cross, but he said his family name would shield him. I stayed silent too long." "Silence protects no one," I told him. "But truth will protect you more than silence ever could. Do the right thing now, and you'll sleep better for the rest of your life." He exhaled, shaky but resolved. He was ready to testify. The next morning, Sophia surprised me again. She had written a list of Brad's known victims and started making calls herself. I watched her from the doorway as she spoke gently into the phone, offering empathy. "You're not forgotten," I heard her say. "We're working to make sure justice finds him." An elderly woman on the other end sobbed with gratitude, and I saw Sophia wipe her own tears away silently. Her heartbreak had transformed into compassion, and it made me prouder than any graduation ceremony ever had. By evening, I realized something important. The wedding had been destroyed, yes, but in its place, something stronger was forming. Justice, community, resilience, those were the foundations being poured now. My daughter was no longer a pawn in someone else's scheme. She was becoming a builder in her own right, ready to carry forward what our family truly stood for. I stood at the window, looking out at the fading light over the hills. The storm hadn't passed, but its shape had changed. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about repair, about rebuilding what Brad had broken and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I tightened my grip on the folder one last time. The next days would define everything, and for the first time, I was ready. If you're still watching and finding these insights helpful, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Headlines arrived before sunrise. My phone lit up with notifications from national outlets, each carrying the same story in slightly different words. $900,000 wedding collapses amid fraud scandal. Brad's mugshot, pale and sleepless, stared back from every screen. Another shot showed him in handcuffs, his Yale ring still visible, as agents walked him into federal custody. The narrative he had worked so hard to polish had disintegrated overnight, replaced by the truth he had spent months trying to bury. By mid-morning, the FBI had raided the offices of Whitmore Hastings Partners. I watched the footage on television as agents carted out boxes of files and stacks of computer equipment. Hastings's cooperation made the process swift. His testimony painted Brad as the architect of forged donor letters, fabricated accounts, and embezzlement schemes masked as charity. The indictments rolled in quickly: wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy. Brad's carefully curated empire had been reduced to a case number in federal court. Sophia sat beside me on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. The wedding dress still hung in the corner of her bedroom upstairs, its lace gathering dust, a monument to what almost was. She didn't speak for a long time as she watched the anchors repeat the details. Finally, she whispered, "I feel like I'm mourning something that never existed." I put a hand over hers. "You're not mourning him," I said. "You're mourning the dream you thought you had. That's different, and it's human." Var, her eyes brimmed with tears, but this time they didn't spill. "I'm relieved," she admitted. "Relieved it ended before it began, but part of me feels guilty for not seeing it sooner, for letting it get this far." "You trusted someone who worked hard to seem trustworthy," I told her. "That isn't guilt. It's evidence of your humanity. The only shame here belongs to him." While we spoke quietly in our home, the world outside was roaring. Clients called to reaffirm contracts, praising me for standing firm. Neighbors stopped by with words of encouragement. My crew, the so-called unimportant people, came together and reminded me why I had built this business in the first place. Their loyalty was louder than the Whitmores' threats could ever be. Still, the Whitmores tried. That afternoon, Margaret called me directly. Her voice was icy, brittle with rage and desperation. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, "surely you understand this spectacle helps no one. My family's reputation, our legacy, will suffer irreparable damage. If you agree to temper your involvement, we can arrange a settlement, something that protects us all." I let the silence hang for a moment before answering. "Mrs. Whitmore, reputations are built, not bought. Yours was destroyed by your son's choices, not mine, and I won't sell my name to cover the cracks in yours." I ended the call before she could reply. That chapter was closed. The next day, Sophia and I stood together at a small press briefing. We announced the creation of the Alvarez Community Fund, seeded with profits from my company, dedicated to helping the victims of Brad's schemes. Reporters asked sharp questions, their cameras clicking in rapid bursts. But as Sophia spoke, her voice steady, her compassion visible, I saw the tide turn. The story was no longer just about a ruined wedding. It was about integrity rising in the shadow of arrogance. The fund became a rallying point. Letters arrived from families we had never met, thanking us for standing up, for proving that honesty could still win. The same society columns that once fawned over Brad's connections now ran editorials praising Sophia's courage. Even my workers, men who rarely spoke about such things, nodded with quiet pride when her face appeared on the evening news. Days later, Sophia visited some of the victims herself. I watched her kneel beside an elderly couple who had lost their retirement savings, holding their hands as they cried. "You're not forgotten," she told them. In that moment, I saw her transformation complete, no longer the girl trying to belong in someone else's world, but a woman shaping her own. As for Brad, his name filled the headlines for weeks, each article another nail in the coffin of his reputation. His allies scattered, his family retreated, and the $900,000 wedding became shorthand for arrogance undone by truth. I sat on the porch one evening as the sun dipped low, watching Sophia laugh with neighbors who had come to share a meal. My chest felt lighter than it had in months. The battle had been long, painful, and public, but the outcome was clear. Justice had been served, and my daughter was free. The house was quiet when I rose that morning, the kind of stillness that follows after a long storm. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The California hills stretched wide before me, painted gold by the rising sun. For weeks, my life had been consumed by chaos, headlines, betrayals, and courtroom whispers. But that morning felt different. The storm had passed. The scars were still there, yes, but the air was cleaner. As I sat in the worn rocking chair, I thought about the weight of everything that had happened. A $900,000 wedding had vanished, a man had been unmasked, and a daughter had been freed. All because I chose to stand firm when it would have been easier to stay silent. I had been called stubborn, controlling, bitter, but in the end, truth had spoken louder than appearances. The screen door creaked open behind me. Sophia stepped out, her hair loose in the breeze, her face brighter than I had seen it in months. She carried her own coffee and settled beside me. "Morning, Dad," she said softly. I looked at her and felt a swell of pride. She wasn't the same young woman who had once tried to mold herself into Brad's world. She was stronger now, clearer, with a fire that no amount of old money polish could dim. "I've been thinking," she said after a sip. "The fund, it shouldn't just be about Brad's victims. We can grow it, make it something bigger, a program for families who need help, maybe scholarships, maybe support for seniors, something lasting." Her words warmed me more than the coffee. "That's a good idea," I said, though inside I was nearly overcome. She wasn't running from the past. She was building something new out of its ashes. I thought of my late wife then, her picture still on the mantel inside. She had worried about Sophia, about whether we had raised her with enough resilience for the world's cruelty. I wished she could see this moment. She would have known the answer was yes. "The real inheritance I gave you," I told Sophia, "wasn't money. It was the lesson that integrity is worth more than any fortune. I'm glad you've carried it forward." She reached for my hand and squeezed it. "I see that now," she said, "and I'm not letting it go." Later that week, letters began arriving. Some from city officials, thanking us for our courage. Others from ordinary people, construction workers, retired teachers, immigrant families, who said our story gave them hope. One note, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "People like us don't often win against families like them. Thank you for proving we can." It struck me that the so-called unimportant people had been important all along. They were the ones who built homes, taught children, staffed hospitals, kept communities alive. They were the backbone, while people like Brad had been parasites, feeding on their labor and trust. As I walked the property with Sophia one evening, she pointed to a patch of land near the orchard. "That's where we could build it," she said. "The community center. A place for families, a place for seniors, a space where people feel seen." I smiled at her vision, knowing she had inherited not just my company's name, but its purpose. "Then we'll build it," I said. We stood side by side as the sky turned shades of orange and purple, a silence settling between us that felt like peace. The story of Brad and the Whitmores would fade into tomorrow's news cycle, another cautionary tale about arrogance and greed. But our story, the one about loyalty, resilience, and earned respect, would remain. The collapse of that wedding had taught me something clear. Wealth without honor crumbles, but dignity endures. And when you pass on dignity to your children, you've given them something no scandal, no betrayal, no loss can ever take away. I took a long breath, the evening air cool on my skin, and turned toward Sophia. "Come on," I said. "We've got work to do." For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like something to defend. It felt like something to build. In the end, the collapse of grandeur revealed a far greater truth than any celebration could have offered. What seemed like the unraveling of a wedding was, in fact, the unveiling of deeper lessons about wealth, dignity, and the measure of a life well lived. There is always a temptation to equate importance with appearance, measured in numbers on a bank account, names etched on invitations, or the shine of a banquet hall. Yet history shows us again and again that such foundations, built on arrogance or deceit, cannot bear the weight of time. They fracture under scrutiny, and what remains is not the memory of elegance, but the stain of betrayal. True importance is never conferred by title, inheritance, or lineage. It is earned, quietly, in the spaces where few are watching. It is forged in years of work done with integrity, in promises kept when breaking them would be easier, and in relationships built on respect rather than convenience. The people who endure, the ones who shape communities and lives, are rarely those who seek to be seen as superior. They are those who lift others up without asking for recognition, who measure success not by status but by the strength of their word. The fall of illusions often carries pain. Dreams shatter, reputations collapse, and those caught in the middle grieve for what might have been. But hidden within that grief is freedom, the freedom to see clearly, to separate the glitter from the gold, to understand what cannot be bought or faked. The unraveling of a false future creates the space for something honest to take its place. When deception is stripped away, what remains is the core of resilience and truth, unshaken by pretense. Wealth without honor is an empty vessel. It can buy the stage, but it cannot script the play. It can purchase applause, but it cannot buy respect. The great irony is that those who chase importance through vanity often end up exposed as the most fragile of all. Their kingdoms collapse not because of outside enemies, but because rot spread from within. In contrast, those who live with quiet integrity often discover they hold more influence than they ever imagined. They move mountains not through force, but through trust built over decades. Every ending is also a mirror. It reflects what was lost, but also reveals what was gained in clarity and wisdom. The collapse of something celebrated for its extravagance becomes a reminder that no price tag can equal character. The most enduring legacy is not a fortune passed down, but a set of values lived out. Those values, loyalty, resilience, honesty, become the true inheritance that carries forward long after money has vanished or buildings have crumbled. The world often confuses noise with significance, but life has a way of correcting the record. The loudest promises fade when tested, while the steady presence of dignity leaves an imprint that outlasts generations. In the silence after storms, what matters is not who stood in the spotlight, but who stood when the lights went out. So, the lesson is simple, though hard-earned. Appearances may dazzle for a season, but substance endures for a lifetime. When deception masquerades as success, it is only a matter of time before the mask slips. Yet, when truth guides every step, even the smallest acts become lasting. Importance is not about where one sits at a table, but about who is remembered when the table is gone. And so, what was once framed as tragedy reveals itself as triumph. The downfall of illusions gave rise to clarity. The loss of false prestige opened the door to genuine strength. In the end, the only measure worth holding on to is not how high one climbs in the eyes of others, but how firmly one stands in the truth of one's own values. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.